In America, we are told that we have freedom, that we are living in a democracy. Now, it got me questioning, do we in fact have freedom? And does a democracy produce freedom? What types of freedom does a democracy produce? And are these freedoms that a democracy produces desirable, beneficial, and advantageous for the people involved in the democracy? Now, this is the question that I set out to answer. And this is the question that we are going to answer in this mini lecture series that I put together for you in the form of a PowerPoint. And the one question that we're going to answer, or at least try to answer, is, does democracy produce freedom? And is that freedom desirable for all the people involved in the democracy? Now, let us begin. Okay, so democracy. What is it? So what we're going to do is we're going to start from Aristotle and his book on politics, because Aristotle is essentially the founder, if not, well, one of the founders, if not the founder, of Western political philosophy. And we're going to examine his forms of government and their perversions, and then we'll move on from there into the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, where I'll discuss the definitions of democracy, what defines it, its axioms, and then you'll be able to grasp a full understanding of what democracy is, what freedoms it produced, where your limitations are, and then you'll be able to make your decision when I'm done with the PowerPoint on whether or not we have freedom, whether or not freedom within democracy is desirable, and if we actually have a democracy in America to begin with. So let's begin. So Aristotle has what you would call correct or virtuous forms of government, and then perverse forms of government, which we're going to examine the correct forms first, which is the monarchy, aristocracy, and a polity. So a monarchy is rule by one for the benefit of all. An aristocracy is rule by a few, the best, most virtuous, for the common good. A polity is a constitutional government ruled by the many, often a mixed government balancing oligarchic and democratic elements. And then the perverted forms of government, he would say these are the corrupt versions of the previously stated. And that's one, tyranny, a perversion of monarchy, rule by one for his own benefit; oligarchy, a perversion of aristocracy, rule by a few wealthy individuals for their own gain; and a democracy, a perversion of polity, rule by the poor majority for their own interest, not to be confused with modern liberal democracy. And then this is what he would call the cycle of constitutions. So so basically you have your correct form, which is a monarchy, and that's going to pervert into a tyranny; and then aristocracy, which will pervert into an oligarchy; and then a polity, which will pervert into a democracy, which will eventually collapse or decay into an anarchy, which we won't necessarily make the distinction on whether or not anarchy is desirable or not, although I consider some forms of anarchy to be a desirable thing because they advocate for full and complete freedom and autonomy and not any sort of authority on the hand of the state, which democracy is a heavy advocate for and proponent of, is the authority of a democracy. But we'll talk about that later. So Aristotle's total practical government. So Aristotle praises polity as the most stable and realistic form of government. It is a mixed constitution that combines elements of oligarchy and democracy, aiming to reflect the interests of the middle class, which he believes is the most stable and virtuous group. Polity allows broad participation but restrains the excesses of pure democracy or oligarchy. He criticizes democracy, not because the people rule, but because in its extreme form it can devolve into mob rule or majority rule, disregarding laws and expertise. Similarly, oligarchy fails by privileging wealth over merit and the common good. This might look familiar to you because I think that America has perverted itself into what I would call an oligarchy. Revolution and stability. Causes of a revolution: inequality and injustice, ambition and greed, lack of participation, disrespect for law. So this is essentially what he would say is necessary in order to cause a revolt, is these four things right here. And then how to preserve a regime, in Aristotle's view, is education and civic virtue, or what you would call indoctrination, in my opinion. A strong middle class, respect for law, and moderation. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which I will leave links to if you're interested in furthering your education on this subject. I'm just going through the basis of what you need to know in terms of developing a foundation and a general understanding of what you need to know in order to, I guess, get a all-around grasp on what democracy is fundamentally. So democracy defined, and this definition is coming from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and this is how they define it. And they define it as any collective decision-making method that grants participants equal say, e.g. one person, one vote. It can occur in families, associations, firms, states, etc. The entry emphasizes that this is a descriptive definition. It does not assume democracy is good or just by itself. Formal equality, identical voting weight, is the core. Some democracies in substantive equality add substantive equality, equal deliberative opportunities, coalition building. Importantly, democracy may be direct, public referenda, or representative, elected officials, but in all cases it centers on equal input into decisions. There is no fixed institutional form. Democracy is defined by who decides, the people, and how, by equal participation. Okay, so now we have a general definition of what democracy is. And now we're going to move on so we can deepen our understanding of what this definition means in its entirety. Excuse me. So we have the justification of democracy. So the SCP divides justifications into instrumental, which are consequentialist arguments, and intrinsic, value-based arguments. So instrumental arguments are responsiveness arguments. And the SCP notes that responsiveness arguments trace to Mill. By regular elections, rulers heed all interest equally. Epistemic arguments, Condorcet's jury theorem, Rousset's general will claim large electorates tend to make correct collective decisions when voters are independent and informed. Critics counter that these require unrealistic assumptions, ignorance, bias, info, etc., but some theorists, Estlin, still propose epistemic proceduralism, where democratic law is legitimate if it yields better than random outcomes and is publicly acceptable. So this isn't necessarily extremely important to understand, although it's just it's laying down the basics for what you're going to learn as we progress to this PowerPoint. So it's just important to understand what an instrumental argument is. So it's a consequentialist argument. So it's basically a responsiveness argument. So all that means is it's just a responsiveness argument. So you need to remember that. And then the intrinsic are more value-based arguments. So those would be more biased type of arguments. And we're going to explore instrumental and intrinsic-based arguments throughout the rest of this PowerPoint. And that's basically how the SCP defines democracy. So you just need to understand that as we progress forward. It'll make sense as we push forward. Okay, so intrinsic, non-instrumental arguments, and these are some of them that are talked about in the SCP. So what we get here is democracy is defended as valuable in itself because it's rooted in liberty, equality, or reason. One strand holds that democracy is required by liberty, since each person has a right to be master of his life. They must have an equal voice in social rules. Laws are legitimate only if they can be justified by reasons that all affected citizens could, in principle, accept. Habermas's discourse principle even states that only statutes arising from free, inclusive debate can claim legitimacy. A third intrinsic approach appeals to equality. Democracy treats persons as equals when imposing collective decisions on them. Nico Kolodny adds a relational equality argument. Because laws involve coercion, only an egalitarian distribution of coercive power avoids rank among citizens. Democracy, which is equal voting power, uniquely provides this, according to Kolodny. Now, more normative claims. Across these arguments, democracy is seen to advance freedom and equality. Freedom is interpreted as self-rule, having a voice in laws that bind you. Equality is both formal, equal vote, and relational, equal respect status. SCP notes a corollary. Democracy may not violate its own foundations. For example, It can't legitimately abolish voting rights by majority vote. Okay, so that's a good thing. Rights to political participation and basic civil liberties serve as built-in limits, since democracy is justified by public equality. Okay, that's good. We like that. That's a good thing about democracy. But the question here is, do we have that in our society? That's what I'm trying to answer here. Now we're going to move on to one of the most interesting parts of democracy, steeped within its doctrines, is the authority of democracy. Okay, so this is how it's defined. So 1, justified coercion. So these are the main concepts that give the state legitimacy in a democracy. So 1, justified coercion. The state's power is morally defensible. Okay, so it must be morally defensible, their coercion. Now 2, derivative obligation. Its directives create duties to obey, not necessarily owed to the state. Okay. And 3, right to rule. The state has a right to command correlated with a citizen's duty to obey. Okay, so now the question is, what does that really mean? So basically, the state is allowed to coerce the citizens within the state as long as their coercion or the reason for doing so is morally defensible. So what does that really mean? Because sometimes people can be a bit morally flexible, especially if they choose to bend their words or spit their rhetoric in a certain way. Things can, start to seem very morally okay even if they're not. Okay. And the state has a right to command correlated with a citizen's duty to obey. Okay, now think about that one for a second. What does that mean to you? Ask yourself that question. What does that mean to you? Number 3, the right to rule. The state has a right to command correlated with a citizen's duty to obey. Ask yourself that again. Now, instrumentalist concepts of authority. Now, instrumentalists ask, even if democracy is justified, does it entail an obligation to obey its decisions? SCP notes that general instrumental reasons for obedience, e.g. social order, apply to any regime. 2. If the majority is likely to be correct, Condorcet jury, I'll leave a link to that. You can get more information on that. Citizens might have reason to go along for overall reliability. However, the SCP stresses problems. Even if majority rule tends to truth, it may wrongly demand minorities' agreement and conscience, not just compliance. 3. Eslin's defensible epistocracy hybridizes epistemic and procedural ideas. Democracy has authority if it is better than random and acceptable to all reasonable citizens. Remember Estlin. But this still faces the freedom constraint. Citizens must at least accept the procedure's fairness. Okay, so that's a good thing. The citizens must at least accept the procedure's fairness. Okay, but if they're being coerced, right, and if they don't necessarily have all of the information and all of the truth, then how can the citizens define what is fair if they're not necessarily being told the truth, if they're being indoctrinated? Now, that's one thing to keep in mind. Now, in terms of conceptions of authority, 1. The SCP discusses theories tying authority to consent or self-rule. Locke argued that by entering society, individuals tacitly consent to majority rule on public questions. Rousseau famously held that citizens consent to the general will. By joining the political community, they agree to be governed by whatever democratic process reveals as the common interest. Some interpret Rousseau as saying properly conducted democracy is the general will. Others see an epistemic spin. A fair democracy is likely to approximate the general good. 2. SCP then connects democratic rule to freedom and equality. Anna Stiltz's view is that democracy secures freedom as independence, not being subject to another's will. To avoid subjection, citizens must have property and other non-interference protections, plus a role in lawmaking. Some argue disobeying democratic laws is inconsistent with treating fellow citizens as equals. For example, Cristiano suggests that flouting democratically enacted laws, like tax or property laws, assumes one's view of justice overrides others' equal say, effectively treating those others as inferior. Under this view, citizens have a duty to accept democratically chosen rules unless the very conditions of public equality are violated, e.g. the assembly abuses its authority. Now think about that one for a second. If you don't agree with it, if you don't agree with majority rule, then this is, in Cristiano's view, you're viewing these other people as inferior to you because, well, they've already established that they agree by majority rule that they are okay with certain things, and, well, you're not. So I guess that the minority gets shoved under the bus here. Limits to democratic authority. 1. Even within democratic theory, limits are recognized. Internal limits arise from democracy's own principles. For instance, Locke held citizens cannot consent to arbitrary rule or the suspension of fundamental rights. Okay, that's good. Locke said that citizens cannot consent to arbitrary rule or the suspension of fundamental rights. Okay, I like that. That's good. Ask yourself if you're okay with that. I don't think that I should consent to arbitrary rule or the suspension of fundamental rights either. I think fundamental rights are important. Now, 2. External limits come from principles outside democracy. SCP notes the idea that democracies cannot abolish basic rights, okay, like freedom, like free speech, or even voting itself by majority decision. Now, that's a good thing. We like that. We want free speech, and we don't want it to be able to be abolished, especially by way of voting. Okay, great. 3. Cristiano, for example, maintains democracy is grounded in public equality, so overt violation of that equality, such as legally disenfranchising a group, would undermine democratic legitimacy. Okay, that's good. We don't want them to have we don't want democratic authority to have too much power. Okay, that's good. Now, 4. The upshot is that democratic lawmaking carries presumptive authority, but it must respect overarching constraints, e.g. minority rights, human rights, that protect the premise of equal citizenship. Okay, equality, that's good. Well, we like that. Now, do we actually have that, though? We're still trying to answer that question. And I don't know if we're necessarily going to answer that question, but I want to get you thinking about it. Do we actually have a democracy in America? And I mean, I don't think that we do, but you can ask yourself that question. Now, democratic participation. And this is the next section in the SCP. And we're just going through this really fast. I'll leave a link to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on Democracy if you wish to read the whole entire thing, but I don't have time to sit here and go through the whole entire thing in its entirety, although you can do that on your own. I'll leave a link to it. Now, political expertise. Plato's Republic argued that only a few, the guardians, in his words, have the wisdom to rule, casting doubt on mass rule. Division of labor. If everyone did politics, other vital tasks, farming, industry, etc., would suffer. Yet, if people focus on jobs, they lack time to study public affairs. Now, rational ignorance and apathy. The impact of one vote is negligible. Downs' calculus shows a U.S. voter's chance of deciding a presidential race is 1 in 100 million, so voters rationally avoid becoming informed. These together suggest that ordinary citizens may not effectively govern or deliberate in complex societies. The SCP notes this tension. Real political equality demands participation, but equal participation demands are often infeasible. Okay, that's interesting. Let's just move on real quick. Now, demands of democratic participation. Now, moral duties of citizens. Okay, many argue citizens should vote as a civic duty, even if one vote likely won't swing an election. 2. Parfit gave a utilitarian justification. If one candidate is substantially better, the enormous benefit to society multiplied by the small chance of being decisive can justify voting. Others claim citizens incur a complicity duty because they are beneficiaries of or complicit in state actions. They should help shape the state through voting. More recent accounts, Maskivker or something like that, frame voting as doing one's fair share in maintaining just institutions. By voting, each citizen contributes equally to shaping the laws under which all we live, or under which all will live. Still, SCP notes worries. Rational individuals may often find making a difference too unlikely, and other good acts might have higher direct utility. So, people get apathetic when it comes to voting or disheartened because they realize that, well, my vote doesn't really have that much of an impact, so I'm not going to vote. Well, this is a problem in democracy now, isn't it? Especially when the democracy gets very big. Demands of democratic participation. Still, principled disobedience. Democracy is said to recognize a pro tanto, prima facie, duty to obey laws. However, Standard theory allows that this duty can be overridden by higher moral claims. SCP discusses civil disobedience as a legitimate channel, conscientious, public law breaking to protest injustice, as Rawls and others have analyzed. The idea is that citizens who see the social contract as nearly just have a provisional duty to obey, but they also have a duty to oppose clear injustices by nonviolent disobedience. Okay, so that's a way to protest against the democracy in a way that's disobedient but nonviolent. So democracy doesn't like violence. Okay, but I guess that's a good thing. We don't really want violence. But that'd be for another video if we're going to talk about violence. Now, demands of democratic participation still. Compromise and public justification. Because disagreement is perennial, many theorists hold that citizens owe each other duties of civility. Okay. Rawls, Gutman, and Thompson argue there are moral reasons, not just pragmatic ones, to seek compromise out of respect for fellow citizens' views. Okay, good thing. Citizens should also use public, shared reasons, overlapping consensus, rather than sectarian doctrine when engaging in political advocacy. These duties aim to moderate conflict so that politics remains a cooperative enterprise despite deep differences. Okay. Now, that is the end of democratic participation. So, like I said, I'll give you a link to the S&P, Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, if you want to really dive deep on this stuff. I don't really have time to dive super duper duper deep, but I just want you to get a general understanding of what democracy is so that you can begin to wrap your head around it and begin to question things deeper and further. So now we're going to move on to the next section, which is democratic representation. So in large democracies, citizens elect representatives. This isn't a representative democracy, which is kind of what America has, although I think it's perverted itself into an oligarchy because it seems like there's a small group of people who are in charge and who have all the influence. Although other people may make a claim to state something different, but this is just the way that I see it. But anyways, in a large democracy, it tends to convert itself into a representative democracy, which is different than a direct one. So S&P reviews different systems and their trade-offs. Formal systems, the entry contrasts single-member district versus proportional representation, and group-based systems. SMD, winner takes all, tends to produce two-party systems, which some argue forces parties to moderate toward the median voter. Its defenders claim it yields stable governments. Okay, so critics, which will be Mill and Cristiano, note it can muffle minority voices. Many groups find no path into power. PR, party list, seats parties in proportion to votes, enabling smaller parties to gain representation. Group representation reserves seats by social category to empower historically disenfranchised groups. The SCP notes ongoing debates, e.g., while SMD may incentivize broad compromise, it arguably underrepresents minorities. PR is fairer to minorities but can fragment politics. Okay, so let's move on. So here are the sections within the democratic representation. So you have your moral principles. So basically, the entry raises two questions. Which systems best furthers democratic values and what duties bind representatives? Okay, so let's explore that. Underlying all is a concern for fairness and responsiveness. For instance, advocates of PR stress that proportionality respects the diversity of citizens' preferences, whereas opponents worry PR may entrench identity politics. These arguments tie back to the justifications of democracy. Systems should reflect the demos and protect equality and influence. SCP. Okay, so now we're going to move on. Actually, let's stay right here. So this is basically the two questions that you should be thinking about. Which system best furthers democratic values and what duties bind representatives? So if you want to go dive deeper into this, you'd go to this section in the SCP and read all of it. So now we're going to move on to social choice and democracy. So the SCP briefly covers modern social choice theory. It notes Arrow's impossibility theorem. No voting system can convert individual preferences into a complete group ranking without violating conditions like fairness, rationality, and non-dictatorship. For example, extending majority rule to 3 or more options can produce Condorcet cycles. A beats B beats C, yet C beats A. This shows that sometimes no single social will exists under majority voting. William Riker argued from this that the idea of a coherent popular will is infeasible in pluralistic societies. Other theorists, Ingham, respond that such paradoxes occur only if one ignores the intensity of preferences or assumes too broad a domain. What are the implications of this? So the SCP treats these results as cautionary. Major decisions can be indeterminate, manipulable by agenda. They underscore limits to majority rules fairness. A majority vote can be fair in procedure, yet yield a paradoxical outcome. Okay, so now we move on to the boundary problem, constituting the demos. SCP asks, who counts as a citizen entitled to equal say within a state? Should voting be universal for all residents or restricted through age, citizenship, etc., or more broadly? When decisions affect outsiders through trade, pollution, security, should those outsiders have a voice? Now, national self-determination. One idea is to align democratic boundaries with a nation, shared culture, history. This appeals to solidarity and shared sacrifice. But SCP notes problems. Modern states are usually multi-ethnic, and this view struggles with overlapping identities. Democratic solution. Let those currently included vote on expanding the demos. This is circular, a voting process defining who votes, and raises obvious paradoxes. Who is excluded from the first vote? Subject to rule principle. Philip Willen and others suggest anyone subject to state coercion, taxation laws, deserves a vote. For example, immigrants paying taxes arguably should participate, but this misses indirect effects, e.g. people abroad affected by a country's policies. So they're basically questioning if you're affected by the policies of a democratic state, should you be allowed to vote? So that would mean anybody in the world who's affected by, let's say, American policies, should they be allowed to vote in our elections? Well, I don't necessarily think they're allowed to, but this is questioning, should they be able to? All affected principle. Jay Gooden's idea that all persons affected by a decision ought to have a say, a cosmopolitan notion. SCP points out this principle is murky. What counts as affected? Williams' thought experiment of whether inaction affects a drowning person illustrates its pitfalls. Having a say could mean a vote or just negotiation power. In practice, including everyone tangentially affected, e.g. anyone benefiting from global trade, leads to paradox and paralysis. So basically, this is saying you can't allow everyone to have a vote or have a say because it's just too many fucking people. A pragmatic compromise. Some suggest keeping traditional boundaries mostly intact for stability. Others advocate transnational institutions. The EU is one example, or confederations as indeterminate solutions. Others advocate transnational institutions. The EU is one example, or confederations as intermediate solutions. Okay, so now we get to, I guess, question and answer, although I'm just going to pose a question now at the end. Like I said, I went very fast through that, and like I said, I will leave a link so you can do your own research and dive deeper into all these subjects. To me, the one that sticks out the most to me is the authority of democracy. Now, the fact that the state has a right to command correlated with a citizen's duty to obey within a democracy seems to concern me quite a bit. And actually, what I would like to do here. Okay, so some theories of democratic authority combine instrumental and non-instrumental considerations. David Estlin argues that democratic procedures have legitimate authority because they are better than random and epistemically the best of the political systems that are acceptable to all reasonable citizens. They must be better than random because otherwise, why wouldn't we use a fair random procedure like a lottery or coin flip? Democratic authority must have an epistemic element, and the justification of a democratic procedure must be acceptable to all reasonable citizens in order to respect their freedom and equality. Eslin's conception of democratic authority, which he calls epistemic proceduralism, thus combines the ideal of public justification with a concern for the tendency of democracies to produce good decisions. Okay, so this basically presumes that democracy is going to produce a good decision. So, will a democracy produce good decisions? I don't know. That's up to you to decide. But to end the video, what I want to do is go into ChatGPT. And what I'm going to do is show you an anarchist counterpoint to democratic authority. And I just want to read it because I want to get you thinking. And that's where we'll end the video. I gotta find it. Okay. So here is the anarchist counterpoint to democratic authority. So the anarchists flatly deny that any state, democratic or not, possesses genuine right to rule. They argue the state's moral authority is always in doubt, as Wolff put it, paraphrasing Kantian arguments. An anarchist will never view the commands of the state as legitimate, as having a binding moral force. If there is no unanimous consent to a state, then the idea of a truly legitimate state is vacuous. Chomsky summarizes the anarchist demand. Those who wield power must bear a burden of proof to justify it. Lacking overwhelming proof, authority should be dismantled. Democracy's claim to authority fares no better. Buchanan argued that any state necessarily creates a ruling class, domination of one class by another, so a democratic government remains an instrument of domination. From this view, majority rule never alone confers moral right. After all, a majority is only a numerical fact, not a moral source. Indeed, Malatesta warned that government of the majority means a minority coerced, either by capitulating or by violent overthrow. Therefore, anarchists see all democratic authority as contingent and presumptive. Citizens are never obliged by mere majority decisions, and should instead practice voluntary cooperation, if needed, civil disobedience against unjust laws. And that's where I'll end the video. So basically, the anarchist advocates for unanimity or unanimous decision making, which in a democracy, the decisions are not unanimous. They are majority rule, and the minority is always undermined in a democracy because it's not unanimous decision, it's majority vote. So that's where I'm going to leave off. Hopefully I got you questioning some things. I know that it got me thinking about a lot of stuff, and if you're like a big, critic and nerd like me, you'll dive deep into this stuff, and I'll definitely leave a link down in the description to the SCP and its whole section on democracy. And hopefully you read it, and hopefully you learn something, and hopefully you continue to learn and question, and yeah, just keep questioning. The most important thing in life is to question everything, especially the government that rules you. So that's where I'm going to leave off the video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Thank you so much.